Snow fell in slow, deliberate spirals, softening the world until it seemed almost peaceful. But Callen Dorrin knew peace was a lie. Freedom, Callen had learned, was not the absence of chains. It was the courage to break them, even when breaking meant bleeding. Here's what Callen knew about survival. You kept moving, you stayed quiet, and you absolutely never, under any circumstances, entered a structure that smelled like wet fur and wildness. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Now let's get to the story. She needed to keep moving, put more distance between herself and the red mark checkpoint, and find shelter before her body surrendered to the cold. 3 nights she had fled through these cursed woods. 3 nights without fire, without rest. Each day the temperature dropped. Each night her pursuers drew closer. The forest of Harrowfen was said to be haunted, by wolves so clever they could open doors, by shadows that moved when the wind stood still. She hadn't believed the stories. Not until now. Then a sound cut through the whisper of falling snow, so low she nearly missed it beneath her own ragged breathing. She froze, every muscle tensing. There again, a howl, mournful and close, echoing from somewhere beyond the ridge. Not the baying of hunting hounds. Something deeper, wilder. Callen squinted through the white veil of snowfall. Ahead, barely visible through the trees, a structure slumped beneath centuries of moss and rot. A hunter's hut, half collapsed but still standing. Smoke. Whoa. Just shadow. But movement, definitely movement, circling the clearing like a current around stone. Apes. 4-legged. Unnaturally still. Wolves, she breathed, her fingers numb around the knife at her belt. The sensible choice was obvious. Turn back, risk the soldiers, take her chances with men rather than beasts. She had barely enough strength left to walk, let alone fight. The rumors of Harrowfen were warnings, not invitations. These woods were not her refuge. Yet she remained frozen, watching as one of the shadows moved closer to the hut. Its eyes caught the dim light, golden, too bright, reflecting something that made her heart stutter. Almost human. Foolish girl, Callen muttered to herself, already moving forward. She pressed herself low against the snow-laden earth, each step calculated, silent. The cold bit through her torn cloak, numbing her fingers, stealing what little warmth remained. Her boots sank into drifts that pulled at her like hungry hands, each footfall a gamble against the sound that would give her away. Just shelter, she whispered to herself. Get inside. Barricade the door. Halfway now. The wolves' attention fixed elsewhere, toward the tree-lean where, saints preserve her, torchlight flickered in the distance. Her father's men. 20 riders, maybe more. They'd found her trail. The hut door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Callen reached for it, wood rough beneath her palm, splinters catching frozen skin. The wolves shifted. One turned its massive head, ears swiveling toward her like a predator marking prey. Her hand closed on the latch. The door groaned open. She slipped inside, and the darkness swallowed her whole. The air was thick, damp fur and something musky, animal but not entirely so. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom, finding shapes. Pelts hanging from walls, crude tools, scattered bones picked clean. And then, in the faint gleam of moonlight spilling through a crack in the roof, she saw them. Golden. Watching her from the shadows at the back of the hut. Human eyes. But not quite. Don't move, a voice rumbled from the darkness, rough and unused to human speech. Not a command. A warning. Callen's breath caught. Her hand tightened on her knife, though she knew with sudden bone-deep certainty that steel would mean nothing here. Outside, the wolves began to howl, a chorus that raised every hair on her neck. And inside, something shifted in the shadows. Something that breathed like a man but moved like a predator. She had fled one hunter only to stumble into the den of another. But this one, she realized as a figure stepped forward into the light, wasn't hunting her. Not yet. When dawn came, Callen dared to look. She had spent the night pressed against the far wall of the hut, knife clutched in trembling fingers, watching those golden eyes watch her back. Neither of them had moved. Neither had spoken again. The wolves outside had fallen silent near midnight, but their presence remained, a weight in the air, a certainty that the walls were all that stood between her and teeth. Now, pale light filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating what darkness had hidden. The man stood between her and the doorway. He was tall, lean in the way of creatures built for endurance rather than comfort. His hair fell past his shoulders in wild tangles the color of storm clouds, matted with bits of forest debris. Scars traced patterns across his bare arms and chest, not the clean lines of blade work, but jagged tears that looked like claw marks, like he'd been pieced back together by something that didn't understand human fragility. He wore rough hide stitched with sinew, clothes made by hands that had never seen a tailor's shop. His feet were bare despite the cold, calloused thick enough to be leather themselves. But it was his eyes that held her frozen. Golden in the darkness, they appeared almost amber in daylight. Human enough to be unsettling, animal enough to be terrifying. They assessed her with an intelligence that made her skin prickle. "You're still here," he said. Not a question. An observation, delivered in that same rough voice that sounded like it had forgotten the shape of human words. "I had nowhere else to go." Callen forced herself to stand, though her legs shook with exhaustion and cold. "I didn't mean to intrude." Intrusion implies ownership. He moved then, a fluid shift that brought him closer to the center of the room. A wolf, she hadn't noticed it in the shadows, moved with him, its massive head brushing against his hip. The beast's eyes found hers, and she saw the same eerie intelligence reflected there. Her breath caught. The wolf didn't growl, didn't bare its teeth. It simply looked at her then, astonishingly, stepped aside, settling onto its haunches as if it had received some invisible command. "You're hiding," the man continued, as though commanding wolves were ordinary as breathing. "From what?" "From men." The words came before caution could stop them. Men worse than beasts. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or distant memory. He regarded her in silence for a long moment, his gaze moving from her torn cloak to her frostbitten fingers to the knife she still held with white-knuckled desperation. Then, with a faint nod, he moved to a shelf carved into the wall and returned with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He tossed it toward her feet. "Eat." Callen stared at the bundle, then at him. "Why?" "Because you'll die if you don't." He turned away, dismissing her as easily as he might dismiss wind or rain. Natural, inevitable, beneath notice. And dead things draw scavengers. Not kindness, then. Practicality. She knelt and unwrapped the cloth with numb fingers. Inside lay strips of dried meat, darker than venison, and a handful of withered berries preserved in what smelled like pine resin. Her stomach clenched with hunger so fierce it hurt. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't respond. He'd moved to the door, easing it open to scan the forest beyond. The wolf followed, and Callen caught her first clear view of the clearing in daylight. Snow lay thick and undisturbed save for wolf tracks, dozens of them circling the hut in patterns too deliberate to be random. And beyond, the forest of Harrowfen stretched in every direction, a wilderness of shadow and ancient trees that seemed to lean inward, watching. "How long have you lived here?" The question escaped before she could consider whether speaking to him was wise. "Long enough." "Alone?" His shoulders tensed. "No." The wolf at his side made a sound, not quite a whine, not quite a growl. Something between language and instinct. The man's hand dropped to its head, fingers tangling in thick fur, and the beast quieted immediately. Callen chewed the dried meat slowly, forcing herself not to devour it all at once. The hut revealed itself in pieces as her eyes adjusted. Pelts lined the walls, wolf, deer, something larger she couldn't identify. Tools hung from pegs, blades of knapped stone, bone needles, a bow strung with what might have been sinew. Bundles of dried herbs dangled from the ceiling beams, filling the air with the scent of sage and something sharper, more medicinal. No books, no pottery, nothing that spoke of the world beyond these woods. This was the dwelling of someone who had either rejected civilization or been rejected by it. "I need to keep moving," Callen said, though the thought of stepping back into the cold made her bones ache. "Before they find my trail again. They already have." He closed the door, sealing them back into the hut's dim interior. 3 men passed within a quarter-mile at dawn. "If you leave now, they'll see your tracks in the snow." Her heart stuttered. "Then I'm trapped." "You were trapped the moment you entered Harrowfen." He moved to the fire pit at the center of the room, adding wood to embers she hadn't realized were still burning. Smoke rose in thin ribbons toward the hole in the roof. "These woods don't suffer wanderers. Most who enter don't leave." "The wolves," she breathed. "Among other things." "Then why do you survive?" He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something ancient in those golden eyes. "Because I'm not wandering." The fire caught, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Callen pulled her cloak tighter, though warmth was beginning to seep back into her frozen limbs. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees with a voice that sounded almost like words. "How long?" she asked quietly. "Until it's safe for me to leave." "Safe?" A bitter smile touched his mouth. "There's no such thing. But if your hunters follow standard patterns, they'll sweep south by nightfall. You can leave then." He paused. "If you're foolish enough." "I can't stay here." "No," he agreed. "You can't." The finality in his voice should have stung. Instead, it felt like relief, confirmation that this strange, terrible man owed her nothing, expected nothing, wanted nothing but her absence. So why did he feed her? Why not simply drive her out into the snow? Before she could ask, the wolf at the door lifted its head, ears swiveling forward. A heartbeat later, the man tensed. "They're coming," he said softly. Callen's blood turned to ice. "The soldiers." "No. The pack." He stood and moved to the door with that same fluid grace. The wolf beside him rose, tail low, and pressed its muzzle to his palm. He murmured something, words that weren't quite words, sounds that belonged to throat and growl more than tongue and teeth. Then he stepped outside. Callen rushed to the wall, peering through a gap between logs. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. Wolves, dozens of them, emerging from the tree line like shadows given form. They moved in perfect silence, arranging themselves in a circle around the clearing. Not attacking, not threatening, simply arriving. The man, she still didn't know his name, stood at the center of that circle, barefoot in the snow, unarmed and unafraid. He crouched, pressed his palm flat against the frozen earth, and went utterly still. The largest wolf Callen had ever seen padded forward. Silver fur, torn ear, eyes like molten gold. Alpha. Had to be. The beast approached the man, massive head lowered and bowed. Not the crouch of a predator preparing to strike. A deliberate, unmistakable gesture of submission, of recognition. The alpha female stepped forward and licked the back of his hand. One by one, the other wolves approached. They touched him with muzzles and flanks, circling him in a ritual that felt older than words. He spoke to them in that strange knot language, and they listened, ears pricked forward, tails moving in patterns that might have been response. Callen's hand found the wall, steadying herself against what her eyes showed her, and her mind refused to accept. This was no hermit. No simple woodsman who'd learned to live alongside predators. This was something else entirely. The wolves dispersed as suddenly as they'd come, melting back into the forest until only 3 remained, the silver alpha and 2 younger ones. They settled near the hut's entrance like sentries. The man returned, snow clinging to his bare feet, and found Callen staring at him with undisguised shock. "You speak to them," she whispered. Not a question, an accusation, an impossibility made real. He held her gaze, and for the first time, something almost like warmth touched his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite approval, just acknowledgement. "They speak to me," he said quietly. "They always have." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Outside, one of the wolves howled, a long, lonely sound that the forest caught and carried. Callen sank back against the wall, her mind reeling. She had fled her father's soldiers into cursed woods. She had stumbled into the den of a man who commanded wolves like other men commanded hounds. And somehow, impossibly, she felt safer than she had in months. "What are you?" The question emerged as barely more than breath. He returned to the fire, feeding it methodically. "That," he said, "depends on who you ask." The flames caught, brightening the hut's interior, and in their light Callen saw him clearly for the first time. Not beast, not man, but something caught between. Something the world had no name for. Something that might be her only chance at survival. Or her death. She wasn't certain which frightened her more. 5 days passed before Callen learned his name. She discovered it the way she discovered everything about him. Through observation, through the small surrenders that survival demanded. He moved through the forest like water through stone, leaving barely a trace. She followed, clumsy at first, breaking twigs and disturbing snow until he showed her, without words, how to place her feet, how to read the wind, how to become part of the wilderness rather than an intruder within it. "Lucan," he'd said on the 5th night, so quietly she almost missed it. They were skinning a rabbit he'd snared, her hands slick with blood, his moving with practiced efficiency. "My name." "Callen," she'd offered in return. He'd nodded once, and that was all. But something had shifted between them, a recognition that they were no longer merely stranger and reluctant host, but two people learning to exist in the same small world. The work came naturally, born of necessity. He taught her to dress game without wasting meat, to identify which herbs would draw infection from wounds and which would kill if brewed wrong. She learned to read the wolves' moods, to understand that the young grey's playful nips were invitation and the silver alpha's stillness was command. In return, she mended the gaps in his roof with mud and moss, her smaller hands reaching places his couldn't. She organized his scattered herbs, creating something like order from chaos. She told him stories of the world beyond Harrowfen, cities and markets and the small beauties of civilization he seemed to have forgotten, if he'd ever known them at all. And slowly, piece by careful piece, they began to trust. "You're healing well," Lucan observed one evening, examining the frostbite on her fingers. They sat close to the fire, the wolves arranged around them like a living barrier against the cold. His touch was surprisingly gentle, calloused fingers turning her hand to catch the light. "Another week and you'll have full feeling back." "Thanks to you." Callen watched his face, studying the sharp lines of jaw and cheekbone, the way firelight softened the wildness in his features. "You didn't have to help me." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." "Then why?" He released her hand, turning his attention to the knife he was sharpening against a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filled the silence. "I know what it means to run," he said finally. "To have nowhere left to go." The admission hung between them, an opening she hadn't expected. "The soldiers," Callen began, choosing her words carefully. "They're not ordinary hunters. They wear the red mark crest. The general's personal guard." Lucan's hands stilled. "The general. My father." The words tasted like ash. She'd carried this secret for days, uncertain whether speaking it would shatter the fragile peace they'd built. General Matthias Dorrin. Second only to the king himself. She waited for judgment, for the inevitable questions. Instead, Lucan simply listened, his golden eyes fixed on the fire. "He promised me to Lord Halvard of the Northern Reach," Callen continued, the story pouring out now that she'd begun. "A man twice my age with a reputation for cruelty. But the marriage would secure the king's northern border, would bind Halvard's armies to the crown. I was the price of peace. You refused. I begged. The memory burned. I pleaded. I offered alternatives. Another daughter from another family, a different alliance. But my father." She swallowed hard. "He told me I was a soldier's daughter. That duty was all. that my desires were meaningless against the needs of the kingdom. So you fled. I climbed out my window on the night before the wedding, stole a horse, rode until it collapsed, then ran on foot. She looked down at her scarred hands, at the evidence of her desperation. He declared me dead publicly, but privately he sent his best trackers to bring me back quietly. Can't have the general's daughter embarrassing the crown. Lucan set the knife aside. For a long moment he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he rose and moved to the small shelf where he kept his few possessions. He returned with something wrapped in oilcloth, ancient, precious by the care with which he handled it. Inside lay a medallion on a tarnished chain. The symbol pressed into the metal made Callen's breath catch. The royal seal. The king's own mark. My mother fled the palace 23 years ago, Lucan said softly, settling back beside the fire. She was a servant in the royal household, one of many invisible people who kept the court running. His fingers traced the medallion's edge, until the king noticed her. Understanding struck like lightning. Lucan. She bore a child the king couldn't acknowledge. A bastard who showed abnormalities from birth. His voice remained steady, but something raw moved beneath it. Golden eyes, inhuman strength, an affinity for beasts that terrified the court physicians. Callen's heart hammered. The king is your father. He wanted me dead. Quietly, of course. Can't have rumors of a cursed prince spreading through the kingdom. Bitterness edged his words now. My mother overheard the orders. She ran carrying me, with nothing but this medallion she'd stolen as proof of my bloodline. He looked up, and in his eyes Callen saw the reflection of her own pain, the weight of being unwanted by those who should have protected them. She made it as far as Harrowfen before the king's hunters caught up to her. She was dying when the wolves found us. His voice dropped to barely more than whisper. They should have killed us both. Instead they stayed. The alpha female, the silver one, she brought food, kept us warm. My mother lived 3 more years in these woods before fever took her. And the wolves raised you, Callen breathed. They gave me what the crown never would. Place. A purpose. He returned the medallion to its wrapping with reverent care. The king who forced you into marriage is the same man who ordered my death. The same crown that made you a commodity made me a curse. The revelation settled over them like snow, quiet, transformative, binding them together with shared grief and shared rage. We're both his victims, Callen said. Yes. Lucan's hand found hers, his touch warm despite the cold. And we both survived him. The fire crackled. Outside, the wolves stirred, their presence a comfort rather than a threat. Callen looked at their joined hands, hers pale and delicate, his scarred and strong, and felt something shift in her chest. Not just gratitude. Not merely companionship born of necessity. Recognition. Here was someone who understood what it meant to be discarded. To be deemed insufficient for the crime of being inconvenient. To choose wilderness over the gilded cages that would destroy them. I thought I was alone, she whispered. You were never alone. His fingers tightened around hers. The forest doesn't abandon those it claims. Days blurred together after that night. The work continued. Hunting, gathering, the endless maintenance required to survive Harrowfen's brutal winter. But now they moved as partners rather than strangers, their rhythm synchronizing like breath matching breath. Callen learned to track deer through snow, to read the signs of approaching storms in the wolves' behavior. Lucan taught her the language of the wild, not words but understanding. The tilt of an ear, the tension in a tail, the difference between a warning growl and a greeting. And in the small moments between survival's demands, they grew closer. She noticed the way his hair caught firelight when he leaned forward to tend the flames. He observed how she hummed while working, old songs from a life she'd left behind. They developed a comfortable silence, the kind that came from trust rather than awkwardness. One afternoon, while repairing a weak point in the hut's wall, Lucan's hand brushed hers as they both reached for the same strip of bark. They froze, faces inches apart, breath mingling in the cold air. Callen could see it spreading beneath his skin like frost claiming a window, blue-white tendrils crawling up his torso, branching toward his heart with terrible inevitability. Each pulse of light brought a shudder that racked his entire body. Each breath came shorter, more labored than the last. Outside, her father's men had withdrawn to the tree line, held at bay by the circling wolves. Shouts echoed through the darkness, orders to bring torches to smoke them out. But dawn was still hours away, and Callen had no intention of waiting for rescue that would only deliver her back to chains. She had this moment, this night, this chance, and she would not waste it. "Stay with me," she whispered, laying Lucan flat on the pelts near the fire. His skin had gone cold despite the flames, his lips tinged blue. The wound in his side gaped open, the flesh around it blackened and weeping. "I need you to stay with me." His eyes opened briefly, gold dimmed to muddy amber, then closed again. A sound escaped him, half moan and half growl. Words in that language she didn't fully understand, shaped by a throat caught between human and wolf. The pack heard him. Outside, the howling began. Not the aggressive snarls of battle, but something else entirely. A sustained rhythmic sound that rose and fell like breath, like prayer, like the forest itself had found voice. The wolves formed a circle around the hut, their bodies blocking the soldiers' advance, their voices weaving together into something that made Callen's bones vibrate. They were calling to him, anchoring him to this world. "Right," Callen said aloud, forcing her hands to steadiness. "Right. You're not dying. I won't allow it." She stumbled to the shelf where Lucan kept his supplies, knocking over clay vessels in her haste. Dried moss tumbled to the floor. She grabbed it, along with strips of bark, a pouch of ash from sacred wood, anything that might draw out poison. Water. She needed water. Callen snatched the largest pot and shoved it into the snow banked against the hut's wall, scooping until it overflowed. She set it by the fire to melt, her movements jerky with barely controlled panic. The water would take too long. Everything was taking too long. Lucan's breathing hitched, stopped, and then resumed with a rattle that sounded like death knocking. "No," Callen snapped, returning to his side. She pressed both hands against his chest, feeling for the heartbeat beneath. They're faint, irregular but present. "You don't have my permission to die. Do you hear me? I forbid it." His lips moved. More of those strange words, barely audible now. The wolves' howling intensified, their voices climbing in harmony. The water began to steam. Callen crushed the dried moss between her palms, added bark shavings, stirred in ash until the mixture turned dark as old blood. She had no idea if this would work. Lucan had shown her herbs for common wounds, fevers, infections, but silver poisoning. This was beyond anything she'd learned. This was beyond anything that should be possible. "I'm going to hurt you," she warned, though she wasn't certain he could hear. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She pressed the steaming poultice directly into his wound. Lucan's scream tore through the night, raw, agonized, and inhuman. His back arched off the pelts, every muscle rigid. The blue light flared brighter, fighting the remedy like oil fighting water. Callen held firm, her own hands burning where the silver poison leached into her skin, blistering her palms. The wolves' howling reached a crescendo, their voices vibrating the hut's walls. "Fight," Callen commanded through gritted teeth. "Lucan, fight it. You're stronger than this. You survived the crown's rejection, survived years alone in these woods. You're not dying from some poisoned blade wielded by my father's lapdog." She didn't know when she started crying. Tears tracked hot down her cheeks, dripping onto his chest as she worked. She cleaned the wound with boiled water, reapplied the poultice, and wrapped it with strips torn from her own cloak. Her hands moved with desperate efficiency, driven by fear and fury and something deeper, something she didn't have words for yet. Hours blurred together. She fed the fire to keep him warm, changed the poultice when it turned black with drawn poison, trickled water between his lips when his throat worked reflexively. And when the blue light crept too close to his heart, when she thought she'd lost him, she pressed her hands over the glow and poured every ounce of will she possessed into pushing it back. Her small, human hands against something ancient and inhuman. Her mortal strength against supernatural poison. It should have been impossible. But Callen had spent her entire life being told what was impossible for her. Told she couldn't choose her own path. Couldn't refuse her father's commands. Couldn't survive without the protection of men who saw her as property. She was done accepting impossible. "You don't get to leave me," she whispered fiercely, her forehead pressed to his. "Not when I've just found someone who understands. Not when I've finally found a place I belong." The admission cracked something open inside her chest. All the loneliness she'd carried, all the years of feeling like a stranger in her own skin. In this brutal, beautiful wilderness, beside this man who was neither fully human nor fully beast, she had found her reflection. Someone else who didn't fit. Someone else who'd been cast aside. She'd fled the gilded prison of her father's house seeking freedom. But freedom, she realized now, wasn't just the absence of chains. It was this, the courage to fight for something even when the outcome was uncertain. The strength to stand beside someone, to refuse to abandon them when staying was dangerous. Freedom was choosing to be here, hands blistered and bleeding, holding death at bay through sheer stubborn will. "I won't run," she told him. "Do you hear me? I'm not running. Not from you. Not from this." The words felt like a vow. The blue light pulsed once more, then began, slowly, impossibly, to recede. Callen's breath caught. She pressed fresh poultice to the wound, watching as the poison that had spread up his chest began to withdraw, pulled back by the remedy or by his own inhuman resilience, or perhaps by the pack's howling that had never once faltered. The sky outside had begun to lighten, not full dawn yet, but the deep blue that preceded it. The wolves' voices softened, shifting from desperate summoning to something gentler. Relief maybe. Or recognition. Lucan's breathing changed, deepened, steadied. His eyes opened. For a long moment he simply stared at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling with effort. Then his gaze found hers, and Callen saw awareness return. Confusion, then memory, then understanding. "You didn't run," he rasped. His voice was wrecked, barely more than a whisper, but it was his voice. Human. Clear. Callen's laugh came out half-sob. "Nor did you." His hand lifted, trembling with effort, and found her face. His thumb brushed away tears she hadn't realized were still falling. "Your hands," he murmured, seeing the blisters, the burns where silver poison had touched her skin. "They'll heal." She caught his hand in both of hers, careful of her wounds. "You're alive. That's all that matters." The soldiers. Callen could see it spreading beneath his skin like frost claiming a window, blue-white tendrils crawling up his torso, branching toward his heart with terrible inevitability. Each pulse of light brought a shudder that racked his entire body. Each breath came shorter, more labored than the last. Outside, her father's men had withdrawn to the tree line, held at bay by the circling wolves. Shouts echoed through the darkness, orders to bring torches to smoke them out. But dawn was still hours away, and Callen had no intention of waiting for rescue that would only deliver her back to chains. She had this moment, this night, his chance, and she would not waste it. "Stay with me," she whispered, laying Lucan flat on the pelts near the fire. His skin had gone cold despite the flames, his lips tinged blue. The wound in his side gaped open, the flesh around it blackened and weeping. "I need you to stay with me." His eyes opened briefly, gold dimmed to muddy amber, then closed again. A sound escaped him, half moan and half growl. Words in that language she didn't fully understand, shaped by a throat caught between human and wolf. The pack heard him. Outside, the howling began. Not the aggressive snarls of battle, but something else entirely. A sustained rhythmic sound that rose and fell like breath, like prayer, like the forest itself had found voice. The wolves formed a circle around the hut, their bodies blocking the soldiers' advance, their voices weaving together into something that made Callen's bones vibrate. They were calling to him, anchoring him to this world. Right, Callen said aloud, forcing her hands to steadiness. Right. You're not dying. I won't allow it. She stumbled to the shelf where Lucan kept his supplies, knocking over clay vessels in her haste. Dried moss tumbled to the floor. She grabbed it, along with strips of bark, a pouch of ash from sacred wood, anything that might draw out poison. Water. She needed water. Callen snatched the largest pot and shoved it into the snow banked against the hut's wall, scooping until it overflowed. She set it by the fire to melt, her movements jerky with barely controlled panic. The water would take too long. Everything was taking too long. Lucan's breathing hitched, stopped, and then resumed with a rattle that sounded like death knocking. No, Callen snapped, returning to his side. She pressed both hands against his chest, feeling for the heartbeat beneath. They're faint, irregular but present. You don't have my permission to die. Do you hear me? I forbid it. His lips moved. More of those strange words, barely audible now. The wolves howling intensified, their voices climbing in harmony. The water began to steam. Callen crushed the dried moss between her palms, added bark shavings, stirred in ash until the mixture turned dark as old blood. She had no idea if this would work. Lucan had shown her herbs for common wounds, fevers, infections, but silver poisoning. This was beyond anything she'd learned. This was beyond anything that should be possible. I'm going to hurt you, she warned, though she wasn't certain he could hear. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She pressed the steaming poultice directly into his wound. Lucan's scream tore through the night, raw, agonized, and inhuman. His back arched off the pelts, every muscle rigid. The blue light flared brighter, fighting the remedy like oil fighting water. Callen held firm, her own hands burning where the silver poison leached into her skin, blistering her palms. The wolves howling reached a crescendo, their voices vibrating the hut's walls. Fight, Callen commanded through gritted teeth. Lucan, fight it. You're stronger than this. You survived the crown's rejection, survived years alone in these woods. You're not dying from some poisoned blade wielded by my father's lapdog. She didn't know when she started crying. Tears tracked hot down her cheeks, dripping onto his chest as she worked. She cleaned the wound with boiled water, reapplied the poultice, and wrapped it with strips torn from her own cloak. Her hands moved with desperate efficiency, driven by fear and fury and something deeper, something she didn't have words for yet. Hours blurred together. She fed the fire to keep him warm, changed the poultice when it turned black with drawn poison, trickled water between his lips when his throat worked reflexively, and when the blue light crept too close to his heart, when she thought she'd lost him, she pressed her hands over the glow and poured every ounce of will she possessed into pushing it back. Her small, human hands against something ancient and inhuman. Her mortal strength against supernatural poison. It should have been impossible. But Callen had spent her entire life being told what was impossible for her. Told she couldn't choose her own path. Couldn't refuse her father's commands. Couldn't survive without the protection of men who saw her as property. She was done accepting impossible. You don't get to leave me, she whispered fiercely, her forehead pressed to his. Not when I've just found someone who understands. Not when I've finally found a place I belong. The admission cracked something open inside her chest. All the loneliness she'd carried, all the years of feeling like a stranger in her own skin. In this brutal, beautiful wilderness, beside this man who was neither fully human nor fully beast, she had found her reflection. Someone else who didn't fit. Someone else who'd been cast aside. She'd fled the gilded prison of her father's house seeking freedom. But freedom, she realized now, wasn't just the absence of chains. It was this, the courage to fight for something even when the outcome was uncertain. The strength to stand beside someone, to refuse to abandon them when staying was dangerous. Freedom was choosing to be here, hands blistered and bleeding, holding death at bay through sheer stubborn will. I won't run, she told him. Do you hear me? I'm not running. Not from you. Not from this. The words felt like a vow. The blue light pulsed once more, then began, slowly, impossibly, to recede. Callen's breath caught. She pressed fresh poultice to the wound, watching as the poison that had spread up his chest began to withdraw, pulled back by the remedy or by his own inhuman resilience, or perhaps by the pack's howling that had never once faltered. The sky outside had begun to lighten, not full dawn yet, but the deep blue that preceded it. The wolves' voices softened, shifting from desperate summoning to something gentler. Relief, maybe. Or recognition. Lucan's breathing changed, deepened, steadied. His eyes opened. For a long moment he simply stared at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling with effort. Then his gaze found hers, and Callen saw awareness return. Confusion, then memory, then understanding. "You didn't run," he rasped. His voice was wrecked, barely more than a whisper, but it was his voice. Human. Clear. Callen's laugh came out half-sob. "Nor did you." His hand lifted, trembling with effort, and found her face. His thumb brushed away tears she hadn't realized were still falling. "Your hands," he murmured, seeing the blisters, the burns where silver poison had touched her skin. "They'll heal." She caught his hand in both of hers, careful of her wounds. "You're alive. That's all that matters. The soldiers. Still out there. But the wolves are keeping them back." She glanced toward the window where pale light was beginning to seep through. "We'll deal with them when you're stronger." He started to protest, to try sitting up. Callen pressed him gently back down. "Rest," she commanded. "That's not a request." Something like a smile ghosted across his lips. "Commanding now. Someone has to keep you alive." She reached for fresh water, helped him drink slowly. His skin had regained some warmth, some color. The blue poison light was nearly gone, concentrated now only around the wound itself. "The poultice is working. By tomorrow, maybe the day after, you should be able to move without reopening it." Lucan's eyes tracked her movements as she changed his bandages, her touch gentle despite her ruined hands. When she finished, she sat back, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave. She'd been awake for how long? A day. 2. Time had lost meaning somewhere between terror and desperate hope. "Callen." His voice drew her back. "Why?" She didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Because you would have done the same for me." "You don't know that." "Yes," she said simply. "I do." And it was true. In the handful of days they'd known each other, she'd learned more about his character than she'd learned about most people in years. He was fierce and feral, yes, but beneath that wildness lived something fundamentally decent. Something that had fed her when she was starving, sheltered her when she was hunted, stood between her and armed soldiers without hesitation. He had risked everything for her. Returning the favor was the least she could do. The very least. Lucan's hand found hers again, his grip stronger now. He brought her blistered palm to his lips, pressing a kiss there so gentle it made her heart ache. "Thank you," he whispered against her skin. Callen's eyes burned with fresh tears, relief and exhaustion and something fiercer. "We're even now." "No." His golden eyes held hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "We're bound." The words settled between them like an oath, like the beginning of something that had no name yet, but felt as inevitable as seasons changing, as necessary as breath. Outside, the howling had stopped. Callen moved to the window and peered out carefully. The wolves lay in a ring around the hut, their bodies relaxed now, heads resting on paws. The silver alpha sat closest to the door, her torn ear twitching occasionally. But her eyes weren't fixed on the soldiers huddled at the tree line. They were watching Callen. As Callen watched back, the alpha's tail moved, just once. Slow, deliberate wag. "Acceptance." "They know," Lucan said softly from behind her. He'd managed to sit up, one hand pressed to his bandaged side. "Your pack now. They'll defend you as they would defend me." Callen looked at the wolves, then at Lucan, then at her blistered hands still stained with his blood and the black residue of poison drawn from his wound. Her father's soldiers waited in the forest. Her old life waited beyond them, the city, the forced marriage, the gilded cage. But here, in this small hut surrounded by wolves and wildness, she'd found something worth fighting for, someone worth saving. And she knew, with sudden crystalline certainty, that she would never go back. Dawn light spilled through the cracks in the roof, turning the hut's interior golden. Lucan extended his hand toward her, and Callen took it, settling beside him on the pelts. His arm came around her shoulders, careful of his wound, and she leaned into his warmth. Outside, the wolves kept watch. And for the first time since fleeing her father's house, Callen felt something she'd thought lost forever. Not the false peace of submission, of accepting what others demanded, but the hard-won peace that came from choosing your own path and standing firm against those who would force you from it. The peace of being exactly where you belonged. 3 weeks after the night of the silver wound, Lucan led Callen deeper into Harrowfen than she'd ever ventured. The soldiers had retreated at dawn that terrible night, driven back by wolves and by the realization that retrieving the general's daughter would cost more lives than her father was willing to spend. Callen had watched from the hut's window as her father mounted his black warhorse, his face carved from stone, and turned away without a backward glance. She was dead to him now. Truly dead. The thought should have hurt. Instead, she felt only relief. Lucan's wound had healed with inhuman speed, leaving behind a silvered scar that still ached in cold weather. He moved more carefully now, protective of his left side, but his strength had returned. And with it, a new purposefulness Callen couldn't quite name. "Where are we going?" she asked, her breath misting in the cold air. Winter was beginning to loosen its grip, the snow less deep, the days marginally longer. Soon the thaw would come. "Somewhere I should have shown you before." Lucan moved through the trees with his usual fluid grace, the wolves flanking them like silent guardians. "Somewhere you need to see before you make your choice." "What choice?" He glanced back, and something in his golden eyes made her pulse quicken. "You'll understand when we arrive." They climbed for hours, ascending slopes Callen would have thought impassable. But Lucan knew hidden paths, places where the stone formed natural stairs, where ancient trees had twisted into handholds. The silver alpha led the way, her torn ear swiveling to catch sounds Callen couldn't hear. Finally, as the sun began its descent, they emerged onto a plateau. Callen's breath caught. Before them stood a ring of stones, not natural formations, but carved pillars half consumed by moss and time. Each stood twice the height of a man, their surfaces etched with symbols that seemed to shift in the fading light. Wolves in profile, their heads thrown back in eternal howls. Human figures with hands raised, fingers elongated into claws. And between them, script in a language Callen had never seen, flowing and wild as water. "What is this place?" she whispered. "The court of the changed." Lucan moved among the stones with reverence, his fingers tracing the carvings. "My mother brought me here before she died. Told me the stories her mother had told her." He stopped before the largest pillar, where a figure had been carved in relief. Half human, half wolf, caught in the moment of transformation. The artistry was breathtaking, so lifelike Callen half expected it to move. "Long before the current kingdoms rose," Lucan began, his voice taking on the cadence of old tales, "there were others like me, the changed they called themselves, born of unions between human and something other, wolf-touched, bear-blessed, eagle-marked. They served as guardians, bridges between the civilized world and the wild places." Callen moved closer, studying the carvings with new eyes. "What happened to them?" "Fear." The word was bitter. "The kingdoms grew. Kings wanted control over everything, land, people, even the wilderness itself. The changed were too unpredictable, too tied to forces the crown couldn't command. So they were hunted, declared abominations, monsters." He turned to face her, and in the dying light his eyes seemed to glow from within. "My mother was one of the last. She fled the purge, carrying the king's bastard, a child who showed the signs from birth. She made it here to Harrowfen, where the wolves remembered the old alliances. His hand pressed against the carved stone. They took us in, raised me as one of their own. And when she died, they kept me alive. Callen's throat tightened. You're not alone then. There must be others. Maybe. Hidden in wild places, living in secret. He moved to another pillar, where smaller figures danced around the base. But I've never met them. For all I know, I'm the last. The weight of that loneliness settled over the clearing like snow. Callen understood suddenly why he'd brought her here. Why he'd waited weeks to show her this place. This was his truth laid bare. His history, his isolation, his reality. This was him offering her a choice. Lucan returned to stand before her, close enough that she could see the silver scar peeking above his rough shirt, could smell the pine and wood smoke scent that clung to his skin. Your father has declared you dead, he said quietly. By now word will have spread. Callen Dorrin, daughter of the general, lost to the cursed forest of Harrowfen. His golden eyes searched hers. But death can be a beginning if you choose it. You could leave here. Take a new name. Start over in some distant city where no one knows your face. Leave. The word felt wrong in her mouth. Spring comes soon. The passes will clear. I can guide you to the forest's edge. Give you supplies for the journey. He paused, and something vulnerable flickered across his features. You'd be free, Callen. Truly free. A whole world waits beyond these woods. She stared at him, understanding crystallizing like ice forming on still water. You're giving me permission to go. I'm giving you a choice. The one your father never gave you. His hand lifted, hovering near her face but not quite touching. Stay or leave. But know that if you stay, this is what you're choosing. The wilderness. The isolation. The wolves. His voice dropped. Me. A man who's more beast than human on some nights. Who will never fit in the civilized world you came from. Callen's mind flooded with memories. Her father's face, cold and immovable, as he pronounced her engagement. The gilded cage of her childhood home, beautiful and suffocating. The weight of expectations she could never meet, the role she was supposed to play. The life of silk dresses and careful words and choices made by others. Then other memories, more recent, more real. Learning to track deer through snow. The wolves' acceptance warming her more than any hearth fire. Lucan's rare smiles, earned through shared work and quiet companionship. The night she'd fought to keep him alive, her hands blistered and bleeding, and known with bone-deep certainty that this mattered more than anything in her previous life. The forest had terrified her at first. It still challenged her daily, demanded strength she hadn't known she possessed. But it had never lied to her. Never demanded she be less than she was. Never treated her as property or prize. If I left, she said slowly, where would I go? Lucan's expression remained carefully neutral. Anywhere. The southern cities are warm this time of year. You could learn a trade, build a life. Alone. The word hung between them. You'd make friends, he said. Find community. Among people who would expect me to be someone I'm not. Callen stepped closer, and satisfaction flickered through her when his breath caught. Who would want me to be soft and civilized? Who would never understand what it means to speak with wolves, to choose the wild over comfort? She lifted her hand to his face, letting her scarred palm rest against his cheek. Who would never understand me the way you do? His hand came up to cover hers, pressing it closer. Callen. I fled a cage, she interrupted. Not to find a different cage somewhere else. I came here looking for freedom and I found it. Not in the forest itself, but in. She paused, searching for words adequate to the feeling swelling in her chest. In being seen. In being chosen for who I am, not what I could be traded for. You're certain. His voice was rough with suppressed emotion. This life is hard. Winter here will kill you if you're not prepared. The forest demands everything. Then I'll give it everything. She smiled, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. I've spent my whole life being told what I couldn't do. I'm done listening to fear. For a long moment they stood there, surrounded by ancient stones and gathering darkness, while the wolves waited in patient silence. Then Lucan spoke, his voice carrying the weight of ritual, of old promises renewed. "Day then. Learn the language of the wild." Callen's answer came without hesitation, clear as a bell in winter air. "Teach me." His lips found hers, gentle at first, then deeper, carrying weeks of restrained longing. Callen melted into him, her arms winding around his neck, feeling his heart hammer against hers. The kiss tasted like pine needles and possibility, like choices freely made and futures unwritten. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, the first stars had begun to emerge overhead. The wolves howled, not in warning but in welcome. A sound of recognition and celebration that echoed across the plateau and into the valleys beyond. Spring came to Harrowfen like a secret slowly revealed. The snow retreated inch by gradual inch, exposing earth that smelled of rot and renewal. Streams broke free of ice, their voices joining the wind's constant whisper. And in the clearing where the old hut stood, new life emerged. The silver alpha's pups tumbled from the den on unsteady legs, 3 of them, all gray as storm clouds. They pounced on their mother's tail, wrestled each other into submission, and regarded the world with bright, curious eyes. Callen watched them from her perch on the hut's newly repaired roof, a smile tugging at her lips. One of the pups, the smallest, boldest female, had taken particular interest in her, following her through the clearing and demanding attention with imperious yips. "She's chosen you," Lucan called from below, where he was fletching arrows with practiced efficiency. "You're responsible for her now." "I don't remember agreeing to that." "You don't get to agree. That's not how it works." Callen laughed, the sound still surprising her with its ease. She'd laughed more in 3 months than in the previous 3 years. "What do I feed her?" "Meat. Patience. Love." Lucan glanced up, his golden eyes warm in the spring sunlight. "The same things everything needs." The pup in question had discovered Callen's boots and was attempting to drag one toward the treeline. Callen descended from the roof with newfound grace. Months of forest training had transformed her movements, made her surer, stronger. She scooped up the pup, who immediately tried to chew her braid. "Impossible creature," she murmured fondly. "Takes after her pack," Lucan observed. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm over the winter months, hunting together, maintaining the hut, teaching each other their respective languages. Callen had learned to read tracks, to move silently, to understand the wolves' complex social structure. In return, she taught Lucan to read the written word, to appreciate the stories she remembered from her former life, to see civilization not as an enemy but as something that had simply failed them both. Now, with spring transforming the forest, new possibilities emerged. "The passes are clear," Lucan said quietly, not looking up from his work. "If you wanted to leave to see what lies beyond." "I don't." Callen settled beside him, the pup squirming in her lap. "This is home now." And it was true. Somewhere between fleeing her father and fighting for Lucan's life, between learning the wolves' songs and weathering her first Harrowfen winter, this wild place had become more real than anywhere she'd lived before. The forest no longer felt like exile. It felt like exactly where she was meant to be. "I was thinking," Callen continued, scratching the pup behind her ears, "about the court of the changed. About what you said, that you might be the last." Lucan's hands stilled. "What about it? What if you're not? What if there are others in hiding, afraid to reveal themselves?" She met his eyes. "We could look. Carefully, quietly. Let it be known that Harrowfen is a sanctuary for those who don't fit anywhere else." Something shifted in his expression. Hope, fragile and fierce. "That could take years. Decades. Then it's fortunate I'm not going anywhere." The pup chose that moment to leap from Callen's lap and attack Lucan's pile of arrows, scattering them across the clearing. They both lunged to retrieve the arrows before the young wolf could chew them to splinters, laughing as they worked. This was her life now. Small moments and large purposes tangled together. Beauty in the ordinary. Sunrise over snowmelt, the wolves' evening songs, Lucan's rare smiles. And underneath it all, the steady knowledge that she had chosen this, that every day she chose it anew. That night, as they sat by the fire with the wolves arrayed around them, Callen watched the flames dance and thought about freedom. She'd believed once that freedom meant escape. Running from what hurt her until the pain couldn't follow. But she understood now that true freedom was more complex. It wasn't the absence of fear or difficulty. It was the courage to choose your path knowing the cost, to stand beside those who saw you truly, to build something meaningful from the ruins of what others demanded you be. Lucan's hand found hers in the firelight. His touch warm and familiar. The silver alpha rested her head on Callen's knee, content. The pups slept in a pile of tangled limbs and soft snores. This was love, Callen realized. Not the gilded transaction her father had arranged, but this, the choice to remain when leaving would be easier. The decision to fight for someone, to build a life with them even when the world said it was impossible. Love that existed in the wild places, where civilization's rules couldn't reach. Love that had saved them both. Outside, the forest stretched in every direction, vast, untamed and full of teeth and wonder. Once it had terrified her. Now it felt like protection, like the walls she'd never had, like home. Callen leaned into Lucan's warmth and let her eyes drift closed, listening to the night sounds she'd learned to love. Wolf song and wind voice and the crackle of burning wood. And she knew, with the certainty that came from hard-won wisdom, freedom wasn't the absence of fear. It was the courage to walk beside it, hand in hand with someone who understood, into a future you built together from nothing but choice and wild hope. And that was worth everything.